This video is going to be a summary of the playlist of videos I have on the Australopithecines, which first appear in the fossil record a little more than 4 million years ago. They last appear in the fossil record about 1 million years ago, the very last of them. By then, they're a little less relevant to the conversation because as of 2.5 million years ago, there are fossils of the genus Homo. And so Homo lived alongside Australopithecines for more than 1 million years, but obviously our greatest interest in this group is because they form the bridge between Sahelanthropus araran and Ardipithecus, which come first, say 5 to 7 million years ago, and then Homo, which occurs 2.5 million years ago. The Australopithecines are the genus in the middle. Let me first just go through some slides I have before we get back to the videos. One of the interesting things about a lot of fossils is that I think in our arrogance we assumed that there were trees, phylogenetic trees, where species 1 would evolve into species 2, would evolve into species 3, giving rise to what was alive today. That these fossil organisms wanted to become the life we see today, and that we would see everything very neatly forming transitions. So whether it be humans or birds or mammals or any group. But instead what we have found is that instead there are bushes. So it's not a tree where all of these lineages are slowly becoming what we see today, but rather there's just a diversity of species, most of which then die. Only one of them leads to the ones alive today. So the Australopithecines are significant because there are so many of them, as I'll discuss in the videos. In general, if you wanted a quick takeaway from the neck up, they look fairly ape-like. Now, that's not entirely true. Their canines are smaller than the very prominent canines you would see in male apes, so notice how small the canines are. Their brain case is a tiny bit bigger, so if a chimpanzee is the dotted line and Australopithecus afarensis is the solid line, it's a tiny bit bigger than Australopithecus, and we could say, oh, the teeth are a little bit intermediate, the lower jaw is a little intermediate between chimps and humans. But apart from those, this looks ape-like and not human-like, especially with the brain case. So, suffice it to say, from the neck up, they look relatively ape-like. But from the neck down, they look more human than ape-like. Now, this would be the first group which we can definitely say were obligate bipeds. So they were bipedal. They weren't as good at being bipedal as you are. They certainly weren't runners. They weren't necessarily very good at endurance running yet. Their center of gravity was different. But look at this hole. Look at the hole where the vertebral column enters the skull, whether it be afarensis or Australopithecus africanus, or any of these, including that's Boisier, that there's a difference. The apes, like these orangutans, gorillas and chimps, the foramen magnum is entering more at an angle, so that the head is going to be held, the spine is held at an angle, the head's held forward, and thus the hands become important for balancing. So these apes are more quadrupedal. But once your spinal cord is directly under your skull, that's promoting being bipedal. And there are so many other things. The hips of Australopithecus afarensis are more like Homo sapiens than chimps. And the same is true of the knee, the ankle. There's no longer a big toe which is grasping. Ardipithecus still had that grasping big toe. So let me just. And so the Australopithecines are this intermediate group. There are many species here. And let me just get started. And the most significant feature about them is they are better at bipedal locomotion, and we can confidently say that they are obligate bipeds. Now, their arms are still long. Did they spend some time in the trees? I'm sure they did. Not as much as chimps, but more than, you know, Homo, which would come from them. Once again, they were nowhere near as good at being bipedal as we are, but there were stages of, you know, adaptation to bipedal locomotion, and Australopithecines are clearly better than the first group, but not as good as, you know, the hominids, which will come later. So I have a you know, once again, I'd said I have some, you know, sillier videos here where I'm pretending, you know, these early hominids are at summer camp and you know, talking about some things there, and so then they're marching for one point of it. But these apes still have an ape-like, you know, brain, but they would have been getting better at walking upright to the point where this was their primary form of locomotion. And, you know, I'm sorry that the video is slow, but in any case, so there's that. But their brain size was still small, still within chimp range. So that's significant that in our ancestors, you know, getting smart wasn't the first priority. Rather, changing the style of locomotion was. As we'll see with Homo erectus, big brains are expensive. Brains are, you know, the most expensive organ that we have. And so therefore, until there were, you know, better ways of obtaining food, you know, we'll talk about fire in the next video, then you wouldn't be as able to support a large brain. And so probably a number of changes had to come before such a cranial expansion was evident. And so if these Australopithecines were asked to throw their heads against the wall and to see what the cubic centimeter volume would be, it would be primarily within the range of chimpanzees in this red range, certainly nowhere near the modern blue range. One of the robust Australopithecines actually would be a little bit in the green. All right, and so there was perhaps, you know, for the most part, the various species here had chimp-like heads and cranial capacities. You know, there were some slight improvements in the robust Australopithecines, which I'll mention presently. Okay, well, I'm sorry, this video goes through different species and what their cranial capacities would be. And it was, like I said, there was some variation in the group, with one of the robust Australopithecines having a little bit larger. And so I have a number of videos I'll just mention that go through the different species. So for example, Australopithecus, there is, I have a number of videos which go through species. So saying a few words about Australopithecus anamensis, for example. When were the species, when did this species live? Where was it found? What types of fragments are found, etc. And then after going through this species, I'll then go through other ones as well. Here's the thing, however. I know this sounds like a weird question, but could Australopithecus anamensis, could it have sex with the next species, Australopithecus afarensis? Now, as odd as that sounds, when we use a species name like afarensis, Australopithecus is the genus, afarensis is the species name. The use of a different species name implies that this group was then reproductively isolated from the other group, that they could not, under natural conditions, reproduce and produce fertile offspring. But here's the thing, all we have are skeletons, and very often impartial skeletons, and there are variations. And so all of this is the best conclusion from the experts who study these. But knowing who's a species and who's not is hard even today. Lions and tigers are different species, but they don't interbreed in the wild, even though they can a bit. But you wouldn't know that from their skeletons. Their skeletons are close to identical. But then if you were to look at some different dogs, like a Great Dane versus a Chihuahua, their skeletons are clearly very different, but we not only put them in the same species, in the same subspecies. So looking at skeletons only is not a perfect way of distinguishing between who's a species and who isn't. But with fossil organisms, that's really all we have. We can say that they live in a different time period, but then a new fossil might be found. That extends a time period. We might say they lived in different parts of Africa, but then a new fossil might be found. So this second name, afarensis, I think, in general, it should perhaps be treated lightly as far as, which members are, how many different species there are, et cetera. So I'm certainly not going to emphasize that. And so the experts then publish research papers after very precise measurements. Sorry about that. And so different species, we don't know who could reproduce with others. So I'd like to just kind of talk about, a lot of the species, in general, perhaps, and then these individual videos could maybe make arguments for, this group was the species versus that group. So the Australopithecines, they were bipedal. How do we know that? Well, the way that the spinal cord entered the brain, that the position of that foramen magnum, that's clear. But then there are others, the changes in the vertebrae of the lower back, of the hip, of the knee. Once again, the large toe was no longer a grasping large toe. And so that these were transitional. Their form of locomotion was far more human-like than it was like that of modern chimps, even though their cranial capacity was less. In general, there's a bunch of Australopithecines which seem more lightly built. And they're often referred to as the Gracile Australopithecines, like the ones that I've shown so far. And it is from these Gracile Australopithecines that the ancestors of the genus Homo arose. And so I have different videos on different Gracile Australopithecines. Kenyanthropus was originally given a different genus name, but it is very similar to these Gracile Australopithecines as well. But remember that I had said that the Australopithecines, they form more of a bush than a tree. There was a number of species which were not direct ancestors of humanity, rather, more like cousins. So this bush of a family group had a number of extinct lineages. So there are a number of species, we think, once again, we could argue about who could have sex with whom and produce fertile offspring. How do we best divide these into to species? But we call them the robust Australopithecines. Among other things, their jaws were so much thicker than the other Gracile forms. Their teeth were so much larger. The portions of their jaw that support, jaw muscles. Some actually even had then a ridge on the top of their skull to provide more room for jaw muscles to anchor. So when one considers these robust Australopithecines, one very general term is true. Whatever they were eating, it was hard to chew. So when we consider, there are a number of these Australopithecines which were smaller, had lighter builds, but these in back, Australopithecus boisiae, Ethiopicus, and robustus, they had incredible chewing apparatus. And so as the climate of our planet, and especially of East Africa, cooled and became drier. What was once forest gave rise to more arid areas. And so it seemed that in addition to becoming upright, this group then adapted to life in more open environments. And so when you look at, just the size of this lower jaw, this mid-sagittal crest, this portion of the skull, the size of the teeth, it's clear that these robust Australopithecines, which were not directly related to us, that they were adapting to chew more fibrous material. So as the environments changed, apparently there were new food sources. So if one were to split hominid evolution into sections, the earliest members, in the time period of say 5 to 7 million years ago, but starting say 4.5 million years ago to 1 million years ago, there was then the second wave. All of this occurred only in Africa. So all of these Australopithecines are known from Africa and nowhere else in the world. So much of the ancestry of our family tree occurred in Africa. And Australopithecines include a number of species which were lighter, more gracile. And it's from this group that human ancestors arose. But then there were diverse species. Africa is an enormous continent. There are different habitats, and millions of years is an enormous expanse of time. So apparently different groups adapted to different regions of Africa, different environments. And so there were also then these robust Australopithecines, which were not directly ancestral to the next group of hominids, the genus